Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins. This coming Saturday, December 20th, I'm hosting a winter solstice celebration here at Simplicity Farm. Anyone and everyone is welcome. We'll be starting things at around 5. There'll be food and drink here at the house and in the Healing and Growth Center. And as well, there'll be a fire, a rather large fire we do each year around this time, and a silent period that we'll share as the fire is lit. And then some space for conversation and stillness around the fire. If this is attractive to you, I'd love to see you come join us this coming Saturday. And if not, have your own amazing time over this holiday time, but in particular at the solstice, being this next Saturday and Sunday, the 20th into the 21st.
So, that sense of stillness that we're going to share, that reflection, that slowing down that the solstice offers us, we wanted to create something within that space of slowing down and reflection. And so, for the sake of this podcast today, a little context. We'll be revisiting No Longer Riding on the Merry-Go-Round, which was one of our early episodes last year in 2024. We actually recorded it at the beginning of March, and we put it out in July. In that episode, we speak to the inner muse and how it shows up in our lives. And what we'd like to offer you today is stepping into that episode, listening to it. And then, Martin, you and I will pause in this moment and offer commentary, reflection, a fresh perspective on what we're speaking to in terms of the inner muse, creativity, creative life force, and getting out of our own way. So we now invite you to revisit No Longer Riding on the Merry-Go-Round. Welcome back to Language of the Soul, Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins.
So, as the new year has begun, looking at it through the lens of the lunar year and the year of the dragon, traditionally, I've been having some very significant, very consistent conversations with friends of mine around trusting themselves, honoring themselves. There's this sense that I get from a lot of the writers, filmmakers, and actors that are in my circles, that there has been this idea, this understanding of trusting oneself, honoring oneself, but it's been very cognitive based. It's not really that knowing, grounding, action oriented space. And as you have been writing about honoring the inner muse, I really love that phrasing. And so I want to begin there with this notion of the inner muse.
Right. So the muse, as I'm relating it in my most recent blog and newsletter, is titled No Longer Riding on the Merry-Go-Round, Manifestation and the Inner Muse. I draw upon a quote to start the piece off from John Lennon. It's actually from his last album in that time prior to his death. And the lyric I share is, I'm just sitting here watching the wheels go round and round. I really love to watch them roll. No longer riding on the merry-go-round. I just had to let it go. And what's interesting about the quote is, from my perspective, isn't so much that John's checking out of life, which I think it was often the narrative. Oh, in order to be in connection with yourself, with the inner muse, you have to check out. You have to remove yourself from life. I would offer that it's something very, very different that unfolds, that what you're really doing is revealing something. So when we use the word manifest, we're talking about, the definition for manifest being to be made clear. But we really don't initially talk about, well, what are we making clear? And I would offer that if we're going to look at it through the lens of a soulful perspective, it's really what gets revealed to us as our lives unfold. In other words, what are we revealing about ourselves? Most importantly to ourselves, but also to the world around us. How does what we're doing show up, right? To me, that's an expression of the muse more than this notion of, oh, can I trust myself or not? And I get the conversation that you're encouraging us to go into, which is, can I trust my heart? Can I trust myself to take good care of my needs? The conversation that I would offer is largely missing on a larger scale is, am I in connection with a practice that reveals my wisdom or my practice with wisdom to me and to those around me?
So here's something that really deeply resonates within me, which is coming back to a different part of ourselves, even a different self, a different expression of you, Martin Perkins, a different expression of me, Ben Umstead. And I'm struck with how the inner muse has shown up for each of us in this podcast really becoming a collaboration, really a decision on both our parts to intertwine with our creative life force, with the intent to talk about healing and growth through all kinds of modalities. And here you and I are over a year and a half ago, speaking to things that still resonate very deeply. And yet the way we're speaking to them now, our cadence, the shape of our voices, the rhythm of our voices, there's a clarity and confidence because we've allowed that inner muse, our shared inner muse and our individual inner muse to unfold.
The joy with which I've experienced this shared podcast, has had this sort of growing sense of enjoyment as a result of the collaboration. In other words, I, starting out, because you had been assisting me with the book, with the audio book, you initially had this, in terms of content, a seemingly subordinate role. We talked, we spoke at length around the idea of collaboration. It's really been lovely to see over the last year and a half how we've manifested what you're describing. In other words, if a muse is to be shared in this sense, it's occurred in this very real way. There's this appreciation, this respect, and well, I used the word already more than once, this enjoyment of the process. And I think that is been a really great learning for me. I don't know that throughout my life I've been particularly good at being a collaborator. And in that way, you've been a really great growth opportunity for me. And the podcast I would offer has grown immensely. And as a result, our collaboration has allowed there to be our own version of learning how to not ride on the merry-go-round of life and instead really listen to ourselves, to our inner voice, but also our shared voice. In my expansion of my work creatively into doing projects for others, a big part of that as well has been me learning how to communicate and collaborate more effectively. And I think I've been doing it well in some ways, and I'm still very much learning how to do it in other senses. But the practice of not doing it through this either reactive or tense, like, or chaotic way, but rather feeling a sense of ease and alignment with it, has allowed it to be a different kind of journey.
Absolutely. And another aspect of this that you touched upon is the learning. And I'm struck by this notion that a lot of the time, and because of the way many parts of our society work in terms of learning, there's delegation, which I think is important. I think delegation is important, but often confusing delegation for compartmentalizing, right? What I'm noticing over this revisit of No Longer Riding on the Merry-Go-Round is because we weren't quite sure what we were doing yet, because we were really in the earthiness of that learning so fully and being okay with the unknown. Whereas now we still do that, but we also have ideas and clarity just kind of flow with this potency that wasn't there. And so I'm struck by how we are in this episode from 2024 because I'm much more in like an interviewer role. I'm much more in kind of a question space. There's much less conversation happening. You noted that kind of edge that you had around creating a public forward facing part of yourself for a podcast and kind of the lecture quality that comes up. And that has shifted so much to where it really is become conversations on healing and growth.
When I cultivated over 15 years ago and continue to cultivate over many years a sense of the intuitive voice within me, it expressed and it still expresses itself through this sense of clarity. And it's taken me years to learn how to express that sense of clarity in ways that feel interactive with another human being, that it offers a sense of inquiry versus a sense of, in some ways, a question that's already been answered internally. When I speak, often I've already spent so much inner space getting clear about the answer that I'm offering. Yeah, the response to whatever is going on. It can sound a lot like I'm presenting something that's on some level already concluded, as opposed to something that's, like I said a moment ago, existing in inquiry. And this work has allowed me to further that, and in ways that don't carry the tone of a lecture. One being is kind of presenting processes, practices. And when I present those practices or processes, there needs to be clarity. There needs to be a sense of embodiment. And I'm learning how to present embodiment in the tone of inquiry.
At this time of year, as we approach the winter solstice, every morning that I've woken up and as I begin to move my body, and there's the sense of my hands and feet, all of these aspects of self being in inquiry, not just how am I feeling as it relates to taking a shower or sitting down with a blanket to meditate or drinking water. These things are very important, but it's the underlying process. It's the underlying inquiry and awareness of those things coming through wisdom, right? Not just kind of a scatter shot or external kind of, I need to meet my needs, but this very playful, very gentle embodiment that's happening that has its foundation in a sense of self that is integrated with physical, emotional, and deeper than that. It's that soulful point of connection.
Yeah, I mean, it's most of all, from my perspective, it's there being walk in my talk. It's that simple. I feel no sense that I can be of benefit to anyone in my life if I'm not embodying what I'm saying is a useful path for growing and healing in this life. And I think there's really great insight in what you're sharing around its and the significance of this coming up for me in this particular way, in this particular time. Seasonally, but also in the world at large, there's just so much uncertainty, so much just pain as I see it. Pain that the pain is always there. There's always going to be life falling apart and coming back together. It's that on the political side of life, there's a lack of hope that there's any sense of answers being put forth that aren't anything more than just theater. And so that uncertainty combined with, you said, the winter solstice, the willingness at this point to simply be willing, to be with this in this season. That's the beauty of any bit of learning, is with each new opportunity, there's a new opportunity to practice with it.
Let's head back to last year's conversation and consider how we were speaking to presence and process. A lot of people in the early days of meditation practice, of breath practice, really compartmentalize. It's the time to do this, and then I go off and do the rest of my life. And I find that as a practitioner of meditation, and in particular with the Tao Yin techniques that you and I have worked on together, that practice, the microcosmic orbit, the meditation is not just a designated time during the day. There's this sense of the wisdom always being present, the wisdom always being accessible from this wonderful depth. And I think for me in my journey, it's knowing that the depth isn't some notion of I have to really, 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 really work hard. It's letting go into the depths.
I'm going to backtrack a little bit and start by offering a quote that appears in the blog/newsletter, and it's from Marcus Aurelius, 2000 years ago, Roman emperor, that presents this path of and practice. And he describes it as what stands in the way is the way. Now, it sounds initially very esoteric. It sounds on some level a bit of a heady notion. But in practice, it's really something very practical within the practice of presence, in the sense that the practice of being present, in other words, breath sweeps mind, but what happens after that when one is quiet? Well, one practices in presence with whatever's right in front of you. As Marcus Aurelius is putting it, what stands in the way is the way. Allow that to be, as mundane as it might be, the revealing moment about who you are. In other words, how does what's standing in my way, what does it reveal within me around how to heal and grow? If the framing is always, and from a soulful perspective it always is, around healing and growth, then what stands in the way isn't always an opportunity to heal, to grow. But the nature of it is obviously going to inform us in different ways. Within the writing, within the essay, I talk about this transition within me from becoming or from being an acupuncturist, an herbalist who teaches meditation and consciousness classes, teaches Qigong, to being someone whose teaching has become the centerpiece of what I share with others. And not as a label, not even as an identity, but as a natural expression in some ways of the quote. What stood in the way for me, not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity, was for me to continue to grow into what I do today through the language of the soul work that I do with students, right? So that's what stood tall in the way. It's often framed in the popular culture, that quote, what stands in the way is the way, is How do we relate to our obstacles? How do we overcome obstacles? And I would offer that Marcus Aurelius was offering something entirely different. He's asking the question or presenting the opportunity as here's what's alive, vibrant. Here's what's in your being, what's in your life. How does that feel? How do you relate to it? All of that informs you about what it is. To point to this idea that it need be seen as an obstacle, sure, I'm not saying there aren't things that don't present themselves as challenges. I'm saying it's a way to let go into the path. In that part where I talk about acupuncturist, herbalist, consciousness teacher, so now we're a year and a half hence from that. And though I've been doing creative projects around Simplicity Farm for 20 years, what I've now expanded into is this creative work for others. And what comes up as it pertains to this larger conversation within this podcast around no longer riding on the merry-go-round is that something very intrinsic begins to change around identity when we no longer ride on the merry-go-round. We no longer hold who we think we are, who others think we are, in quite the same way. Of course, there's always going to be naysayers, and that's just a given in life. There's so many different paths to so many different ways to do anything, and so many people who may not be interested or want to see what you're doing in life or in how you're doing it, right? And because my approach to life is so focused on the inner journey, one could even describe it as carrying a lot of the elements of the divine feminine within its framework. It leaves a lot of people, especially in the larger world, uncomfortable and being okay with their discomfort and not either attempting to convince others or in some way trying to get the world to be okay with who I am. I think that's another part of that I've really learned a lot over the last couple years of this life of being very okay with where I'm at, how it continues to evolve, where my energy goes, right? Yes, I teach classes. Yes, I work as an acupuncturist and as an herbalist. And I also spend a significant amount of time now working on creative projects for others or commission pieces or just pieces I'm going to bring out into the world and on whatever platform they may or location they may get sold, right? And that comes with all of its own sets of uncertainty, right? Because there's always the unknowing as a creative. How will others take what you're doing? Will they be okay? Will there be an audience for what I'm doing? And it's kind of the question we've continued to be in as we produce this podcast. Who will listen, right? And will the size of our audience define our experience or not? All that is tied into this very loose holding of what it means to be who we each are individually.
This loose holding there, I mean, it goes back to something that I toyed with a lot in my early 20s, where I was writing a lot. I was writing a lot of short stories, and I kind of defined a lot of creativity through that. But then something started to change as I read different kinds of authors, as I expanded my scope of my preferred mediums, right? Because there are certain mediums that I resonate with more deeply. Novels, feature films, full albums, LPs, very traditional 20th century mediums. But I became very playful with the notion of myself because I saw all of them as these very potent storytelling mediums, right? And so I started to go around and say, storyteller, that's what I am. But through that self-doubt that can grow when you're in your 20s, when you're really wanting to honor that childhood wisdom and grow and heal those childhood wounds as well, and the thorny, precarious qualities that can come up with that. Sometimes that notion of storyteller then became too entrenched in the egoic, right? And too entrenched in external expectations. And this is something in the Merry-Go-Round podcast and speaking to what happened here with creating the center. I'd like to go back and hear this segment of the podcast about what occurred as you stepped into a scope, a depth, a quality of a project that was so transformative on so many levels, and I think speaks to what you just shared. I'm speaking to you from your office at Simplicity Farms Healing and Growth Center, the Learning Center, Creative Center. These are all terms that you've thrown around. It's a very warm and inviting space because of the way that you chose to construct the containers that you adapted and bring all this natural wood into the space, really warm, creating this, expanding your physical space just from the acupuncture room into a classroom, into an office, into this whole complex. That was a challenge. Could you talk a little bit about what that challenge was like, the opportunity that was there to let go?
So, 2012, I've set forth this vision to expand what had been a very small building that had a treatment room, a bathroom, a small waiting room. And I wanted to have a large classroom. I wanted to have a separate office space, a kind of creative space for me personally, as well as a space that I could put an herb room into. And so I embarked upon it. I kind of dove in with this idea of building. What I intended and ultimately created was I took what was in essence three Amish sheds, put a face on the front so that at least from the front, they're very clearly one building, interconnected them, took a lot of recycled material and built it in large measure. With the exception of the HVAC, I built it myself. And so it happened fast. And it also initially was built without a permit. Nearing what I envisioned, a few months into the process, what I envisioned was my completion point. Up pulled a very kind, understanding man from the county, an inspector, in essence saying, "Hey, so do you have a permit for this?" I had this very clear sense from the very moment he pulled up. I needed to be forthwith with him, be very clear. From the moment he pulled up, it felt like this was part of the manifestation process, that what I was creating, and if we take that definition of manifest is, to be made clear, that I needed to be very clear with him. So we walked around the space. He said to me at one point, "I get why you might not have thought that you needed a permit for this, but you do." And that took me on a whole journey that took a year to go from developing the plans with the assistance of Gary Stewing to really reconceiving the notion of what it meant to build the space. And that's really where the notion of significant opportunities for growth stepped in, because I stopped insisting upon this notion that it had to get done as soon as possible, that on some level, the completion of the space or the lack of completion of the space was an obstacle in my life, that it was in some ways blocking me from reaching where I wanted to be, which is teaching classes. I didn't grasp quite to the degree that I needed to how significant the walk and my talk needed to be in alignment in order for me to be out there teaching the work. Really, walking the work. And so that next year was very immersive as I learned to let go into the creative space, to let go into a playful space, to let go of the notion of artificial deadlines and really listen inwardly to the opportunities to heal and grow. And it was extraordinary. I would not for even a second want anything to be different than how it unfolded. I have no regret over that year invested. It was extraordinary, really quite revealing to me about my own inner journey and what it was that I was called to share with others.
I really hear the significance of this lesson. I mean, you really learned how to let go into that playfulness in a way that is so immediate to me in visiting that space because every little corner has such thoughtful little details. There's some hidden compartments. There's just the way the ceiling almost feels like it's breathing because of the shape of the wood. I don't think that stuff would have been that way had you just gone through it to get to classes right off the bat. I mean, there's that spark of the inner muse, but it was like running a relay race instead of going, I'm going to take this walk through the forest. It's such a grounding, sobering step into the reality of what manifestation actually is. You've used the words airy, fairy way of thinking about this that we can get stuck on in the essay. And that's stood out to me because manifestation is really just the clarity of your intention and stepping into your actions. This podcast really is even a testament of that, where I said, I have an idea for a podcast, and I'd also like to take the opportunity to work on the notion of us doing a podcast together. I think that both of these things will go hand in hand and will allow me the skills and the comfort and the ease and the knowledge to do all of this. So there's that manifestation. Manifestation can sometimes feel very practical in that way. The creativity doesn't leave, but to me, there's this sense of everyday living, every moment unfolding. That's the doorway into manifestation, not being off with your head in the clouds. It really speaks to what John Lennon wrote in Watching the Wheels, being an observer to the experience. He doesn't have to recreate the wheel. It's there. He's patient with it. He has gratitude for it. I really love to watch them roll.
As you speak, I'm very aware that the muse, in many ways, the soulful muse, is literally an experience that exists within its own timetable that will often feel like it gets in the way of our ambition, which, I feel like I articulated in the description of how my relationship to the building of the Healing and Growth Center played out. But leading up to that, and even at the beginning, my ambition wanted to argue with healing and growth in those earlier stages and even along the way. Why is this taking so long? Can't there be a more direct path? And I learned how to practice with those feelings, to not push them away, but give them a place to be heard, but also a place for them to be grieved so that something could arrive in its place that didn't feel like I was having an internal argument, that there was a way for me to be not just patient, but ultimately to let go of all of the notions of when I'm supposed to have something done and all of those kinds of stories that humans, in a broader sense, make up. even when there is a hard deadline, to maybe let go of, oh, I'm not going to get all that I intended to get done, and that can be okay. Even more so, that it's more than it's just okay, that the journey there was as important as what you got done. And that feels like a most crucial element of the manifestation journey, of really, and coming back to that initial question that you ask about trust. Trusting in ourselves to be okay with where we are right now. I want to touch upon around the notion of creation. And the big one that stood out is that here I am 11 or 12 years out from the building as we discussed it. For those initial years, there were a lot of people coming in and out. And then the pandemic came along. Now, if I hold on to the notion of what some notion of my identity around that building and its creative expression, and as well hold on to this idea that its function remain intact, its initial function, intended function. There's a stagnancy there. In other words, what I'm learning about myself is that as a human being, I have gone through, probably much more so than most human beings of my generation, these kind of constant and kind of ongoing recreations of self in terms of how it expresses itself. I look back 35 years and, I'm working for a swimming pool company. I'm in acupuncture school. Before that, I had an import-export business. During my career as a healing practitioner, I've practiced acupuncture, plant spirit medicine, Mayan massage, Tao Yin, and a number of different Qigong practices. It's been this constant evolution, and so much so that it really begs the question, you know, for anyone in my life, it's like, how do you keep up with how I'm growing and evolving as a human being? And not that it's anyone else's responsibility, because it isn't, right? It's mine. And because I'm not always necessarily the best communicator of those changes, because I'm always so focused on the inner process, um, I think it kind of looks, I think it looks different on the outside than it looks on the inside. And I'm not sure quite even what I know what that means. And I'm not so focused on it, but it's really interesting to me that, I built this building. Yes, there are still gatherings, there's still sessions occurring, but not nearly with the frequency as there was pre-pandemic. And I had to accept that part of it because I know people aren't out and about in the same way that they were before the pandemic. And part of that is quite brilliant, really. There's a level of self-care. People aren't necessarily desperately seeking social interaction. The tragic part is that there may be finding it in less than optimal places, i.e., social media, but that's the nature of the changing world we're in. It won't change my approach to things. I'm going to keep doing this thing I do. And, I'm moving into this, or have moved into this very rich vein, if we're going to use a kind of mining or tunneling thing into life. I see this just incredible opening for creativity and play over the next many years. I guess where I'd want to leave off this merry-go-round conversation is just simply the recognition that this notion of the muse and the manifestation conversation is one that's ongoing in all of us. And if we're listening, there's going to be ongoing and continuous opportunity to take, radical left turns.
Thinking about this episode, but listening to this over and over and over again, and writing into some stuff earlier last week as we prepared for this, and then chose to take a different route, chose to take another left turn in our process, how the interview shows up. In hearing you speak to those left turns and also reflecting upon these earlier conversations when we were finding our footing, I think one thing that I find fascinating and hearing myself and not really bringing like a sense of judgment or shame around how much better I am at speaking to the personal feeling of it. I'm very good at presenting the macro picture. I've always been excellent at that, but so afraid of relating that and being in dance in a concert with my own inner experience, and I hear that in the episode from last year. I hear how that is just so different now. So my offering today to reflect the inner muse and how much that's changed is in going how it keeps showing up for our work with the pod. We've talked a lot more over the last few months about how we can like be more playful with poetic quality, lyrical quality. And we played a lot with music. You've played a lot with different images and metaphors. I would like to offer some lyricism that was actually born out of a moment in which I felt anxiety and doubt and chose to recognize both of them as part of the creative life force. I think that that's something that has been an undercurrent throughout listening to this past episode. How we feel and all the feelings that we feel are part of that process. What's in the way is the way. So I'm going to read where that anxiety and doubt actually took me. Marble roads and marble ceilings. What's the scope? I've got a feeling it's all just inside out. Tension in the need to be right, a vein of doubt fit to burst. Reckless might, a resurgence of the fate of fright. Reckless might, a blizzard or a sacred plight. I've got a feeling it's all just inside out. Silver strands and woolly blankets, stars tangled in my pocket. I've got a feeling morbid jerks and prattling bone men, reckless bite, lunar ticks, and unappraised clerk filings, reckless and trite. I've got a feeling it's all just inside. That really speaks to how we take those left turns, how we continue to love the inquiry, and that each moment of it and each thing that may be a challenge, like what occurred with the Creative Center, how it was transformed and perceived over the course of the pandemic. I would offer this because of what happened in the pandemic, because of what happened in our society and how people interacted, the impact that your artistry and craft and skill in everything that you've done at your house, everything you've done at the Creative and Healing Center, when people came over, this directly led to people asking you to do projects with them.
It did. It did.
So talk about the full depth of the journey.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Martin, for stepping into this space with me and revisiting and building and growing these points of connection and creativity. It is really quite nourishing. And I think that's a very important part of this time of year, to find that inner nourishment and to find that interpersonal expressive nourishment. So thank you.
Thank you. And I receive your gratitude and I offer it in turn to you. It's been a real pleasure doing this pod today and kind of reflect back on this year and a half journey together so far.
Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.